Well, this was a protest that was banned at the 11th hour. It's been planned for 4 weeks or so. Farmers from across the country, from Yorkshire, from Somerset, working with the Met Police to bring about 500 tractors outside Downing Street, angry at, of course, the inheritance tax reforms announced in the budget last year.
1 minute you're scrolling through the news, and the next, the streets of London are buried under mounds of potatoes and cabbages. Not metaphorically, literally. 11 tons of produce, dumped right into the capital's arteries by farmers who had enough. And they didn't come quietly. 150,000 tractors. That's not a protest. That's a full-scale mobilization. This was a historic show of force from British farmers. And it wasn't just about food. It was about being pushed to the edge, with tensions rising across the UK and thousands taking to the streets of London right now. It's more important than ever to see the full picture. If you want to stay updated on the situation as it unfolds, make sure to hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. I'm covering the angles a mainstream media might miss, like this video if you believe in unfiltered reporting, about losing subsidies, watching fuel and fertilizer costs spiral, and seeing trade policies gut domestic agriculture while politicians look the other way. It was about making themselves impossible to ignore in a system that's consistently failed them. They descended on Westminster with one purpose: pressure. Not for the day, not for the photo op, but for the long haul. This wasn't a scattered group of angry landowners. It was a nationally coordinated action, with rotating positions, endurance plans, and full regional participation. The kind of scale and discipline that makes governments nervous, not because of how loud it is, but because of how calculated it is. This wasn't a breakdown. It was a strategy. The symbolism hit hard. You want to overlook us? Fine, we'll block your capital with the food we grow. The potatoes and cabbages weren't waste. They were a message. You can't separate agriculture from society and expect the country to run. This is what happens when you try. For over 10 hours, farmers held the line, not with violence or chaos, but with vehicles and vegetables. Tractors blocked roads. Produce became barricades. Protesters stayed on rotation, prepared for a drawn-out campaign. And while security forces scrambled to contain it, with water cannons, barriers, and police deployment, the farmers didn't budge. What you saw on those streets wasn't a traffic disaster. It was civil disobedience that had evolved. And here's where it gets deeper, because this wasn't about getting a fast yes from the government. It was about embedding the protest into the political atmosphere. This wasn't designed to end. It was designed to linger. By showing they could sustain their presence, the farmers flipped the narrative. They didn't have to win in the moment. They just had to become unavoidable, something the government had to reckon with every day, not just for one news cycle. And that's exactly what happened. Because the longer the protest continued, the more obvious it became that this wasn't just another grievance. It was a strategic shift in how people resist. No more in and out. I know things feel really heavy in the UK right now. There's a lot of division and noise on the streets, but I want this channel to be a place where we can come together. If you want to be part of a supportive community, please subscribe. And like this video to show some love to everyone feeling anxious about the state of things right now. Stay safe out there, everyone. Demonstrations. No more hoping to trend online. This was about normalizing pressure, creating an environment where civil unrest doesn't spike. It simmers. The government didn't know how to handle that. Lockdowns? They didn't work. Increased police presence? Just made the protest look more legitimate. The visual of tractors lining central London and vegetables clogging major roads was too powerful to dismiss. It sent a clear message. We are here, we are many, and we're not moving. That level of visibility doesn't fade. It sticks, especially when it's timed as perfectly as this one. End of the year, when policies are being finalized, when budgets are closing, when politicians are scrambling to wrap up loose ends before the next cycle. The farmers knew exactly when to strike. They made sure that rural discontent entered the halls of government through the front door, uninvited but impossible to ignore. Whether or not any official was ready to act on it didn't matter. The point was that they now had to deal with it, and that changed everything. This wasn't just a protest against specific policies. It was a broader statement on post-Brexit failures. The promise of sovereignty, of support for British industries, of prioritizing domestic production, all of it has unraveled. And nobody has felt that collapse more directly than farmers. What they did in London exposed the deepening divide between rural communities and the government that's supposed to represent them. The distance is no longer ideological. It's physical. It's being measured in tons of dumped food and thousands of tractors parked where policy gets made. And it's no longer a one-off. The real consequence of this protest isn't what happened that day. It's what it normalized. Because now, disruption has become part of governance. The government didn't resolve anything. They just managed it. And that's a shift from prevention to damage control, from decisive action to prolonged containment, from fixing the issue to navigating the fallout. The risk? That this becomes a standard operating procedure, that persistent unrest becomes part of a routine. That's not a sign of stability. That's a sign of dysfunction becoming sustainable. And once disruption becomes background noise, it becomes harder for governments to distinguish between short-term discontent and systemic breakdown. Everything blurs into one long, unresolved crisis. And that's where legitimacy starts to crumble. Because if grievances are never addressed, just tolerated, trust erodes. People stop believing that the system can or will work for them. And when that belief goes, resistance doesn't end. You've seen the headlines, but the atmosphere down here is completely different. Subscribe so you don't miss the raw footage I'm releasing later this week. And like this video to help push this unfiltered reporting up the algorithm. It intensifies, which brings us back to what the farmers achieved, even without immediate concessions. They didn't just raise awareness. They changed the rules. They show that persistence is power, that organization and endurance can force a government's hand more effectively than slogans or marches, that the most effective protests aren't necessarily the loudest. They're the ones that don't go away. And it won't stop here. Other sectors are watching. Transport unions, teachers, public sector workers. Any group pushed to the margins by budget cuts or political neglect now has a blueprint. You don't have to demand attention. You just have to occupy space and stay there. The political cost of ignoring protests just went up, because this model doesn't rely on escalation. It relies on exhaustion. Not violence, but visibility. And it works. What the farmers did was establish a new baseline, a new normal, where unrest isn't disruptive, it's embedded. Where protest doesn't seek resolution, it becomes part of the process. Where public frustration stops being an outlier and starts being constant. The pressure isn't going away. It's only shifting from the streets to the negotiation tables, to every future budget decision, to every press conference where a minister has to field yet another question about agriculture and unrest. The consequences go further. Because once the government has accepted this kind of disruption as a cost of doing business, it signals to every other movement that long-term pressure is not only possible, it's effective. And that has implications not just for policy, but for how governance itself functions. When endurance becomes more powerful than immediate confrontation, politics has to adapt or risk becoming paralyzed. That's the long-term threat. Because when institutions are forced to govern through the noise of persistent unrest, policymaking slows, risk aversion increases, and everything starts revolving around conflict management rather than progress. And if that becomes the status quo, you've got a government that's no longer leading, just reacting. This is what the farmers' protest revealed. Not just about agriculture, but about the state of democracy, about the power of presence, about what happens when people who've been ignored stop asking politely and start showing up and not leaving. They didn't need to cause a riot. They didn't need to make threats. They just had to show that they could stay longer than the government's patience. And they did. So while no laws changed overnight, something bigger did. The terms of engagement, the very foundation of political negotiation. From now on, showing up is no longer the first step. It is a tactic. And if this becomes a new normal, if civil discontent becomes a permanent fixture of political life, with tensions rising across the UK and thousands taking to the streets of London right now, it's more important than ever to see the full picture. If you want to stay updated on the situation as it unfolds, make sure to hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. I'm covering the angles the mainstream media might miss. Like this video if you believe in unfiltered reporting. Governments across sectors will have to adapt, because the message has been sent, loud and clear. We're not going anywhere. If you're watching all of this unfold, if you've been tracking how this protest redefined resistance, how it reshaped the political narrative, how it put rural voices at the center of the conversation, then it's time to speak up. Drop your thoughts in the comments. Do you think this protest changes how future movements will operate? Did the farmers go too far? Or is this what happens when no one listens? Hit like if you're seeing the bigger picture here. Share this with someone who still thinks tractors can't change policy. And if you want more breakdowns of the chaos that shapes real power, subscribe. Because the streets might be clear today, but the pressure, it's still there, and it's not going anywhere. And here's the part that's hard to overstate. They didn't win, but they didn't need to. No concessions were handed out. No emergency subsidies announced. No sudden reversal of trade policies. On paper, nothing changed. But on the ground, everything did. Because when a protest can sit in the middle of your capital, outlast your security response, dominate your news cycle, clog your roads, drain your resources, and still hold a moral high ground, that's not a loss. That's a power shift. Governments are used to dealing with protests that are reactive, loud for a day, maybe two, easy to cordon off, easier to forget. This wasn't that. This was proactive, planned, aimed not at crisis but duration. The farmers didn't just want to make a point. They wanted to plant themselves in the conversation and stay there. And they succeeded. Because now, even after the last potato has been scraped off the pavement, Westminster is still dealing with the fallout. What they did was political embedding, turning civil unrest into a fixture of the policy landscape. Something that can't be ignored or dismissed, only managed. And that's the risk moving forward. That government stops aiming to solve and starts trying to live with protest. Just like with inflation, or housing crises, or strikes. When everything becomes a prolonged issue, nothing ever gets resolved. It's governance by tolerance, not by action. And that's where legitimacy starts to rot. You can't govern a country effectively if the people outside your building, in actual tractors, are more organized than the people inside it. And that's exactly what this looked like. Let's go back to those visuals. Westminster, the symbolic seat of British democracy, turned into a maze of metal and vegetables. Cabbages rolling. I know things feel really heavy in the UK right now. There's a lot of division and noise on the streets, but I want this channel to be a place where we can come together. If you want to be part of a supportive community, please subscribe. And like this video to show some love to everyone feeling anxious about the state of things right now. Stay safe out there, everyone, through intersections. Potatoes piled up like sandbags. Police trying to rear out buses around literal fields that had taken root in the city. That's not just disruption. That's political theater with teeth. And it worked because the visuals did the talking. You didn't need to read a manifesto. You just had to look outside. And the message was everywhere. If you won't hear us in meetings, we'll block the roads to yours. If you won't support the people who feed your country, we'll show you what happens when we stop pretending everything's fine. And here's what might be even more important than the protest itself, the reaction to it, not the government. We already know they leaned on familiar tools. Barricades, patrols, vague statements. That wasn't surprising. What stood out was how the public started recalibrating. This didn't spark widespread outrage against the farmers. Because deep down, a lot of people understood what was happening. Maybe not everyone knew the policy details. But when they saw food being dumped in the streets, they understood one thing. This isn't waste. This is warning. Even city dwellers, people used to associating tractors with slow country roads, could see the bigger picture. This wasn't just rural frustration. It was a nationwide signal that something is deeply off in how the country treats its most foundational industries. Farming isn't trendy. It's not glamorous. It doesn't get flashy press conferences. But without it, nothing functions. And this protest forced everyone, voters, media, politicians, to confront that fact. And the normalization of this kind of demonstration, that's now part of the toolkit for future movements. Because this didn't descend into violence. It didn't alienate the public. It didn't burn bridges. It just parked on top of them, literally. And that approach, calm, visual, relentless, might just be the most dangerous kind of protest there is. Not because it breaks laws, but because it breaks the rhythm of governance. The rhythm that assumes people will shout, be heard, and then move on. The rhythm that says problems can be managed if you just wait long enough. This protest disrupted that rhythm. It lingered, and in doing so, it rewired expectations. The next time a government hears rumblings of civil unrest, they'll remember this, not because of a headline, but because it proved something frighteningly effective. You don't need 1 million people. You just need enough to not leave. And when a movement sticks around long enough, it stops feeling like an emergency and starts feeling like a fixture. And that's when the real shift happens. You've seen the headlines, but the atmosphere down here is completely different. Subscribe so you don't miss the raw footage I'm releasing later this week, and like this video to help push this unfiltered reporting up the algorithm. When discontent becomes part of the scenery, the risk? That this becomes policy's new opponent. Not ideology, not opposition parties, but embedded resistance. Protest that doesn't flare up, but simmers just beneath the surface, for weeks, months, even longer. It's the kind of slow pressure that's harder to dismiss because it doesn't require escalation. It thrives on presence, on patience, on the sheer psychological weight of we're still here. And if that becomes the new model, if other groups borrow from this strategy, what we're looking at is a long-term change in how political momentum is built. Not through headlines, but through duration. And that's hard for institutions to fight. Because how do you argue with a protest that's orderly, that's prepared, that's not just angry, but operational? When a protest becomes a second job with participants, when it survives a news cycle, when it starts to bend time and space around itself, the power dynamics shift. The government's no longer trying to quell unrest. It's trying to outlast it. And if that's your political strategy, you're already playing from behind. And even if this protest didn't result in immediate changes to agricultural policy, that doesn't mean it failed. Quite the opposite. The farmers did exactly what they needed to do, set the stage. They took rural issues and made them national. They reframed discontent as a campaign, not a crisis. They established presence, demonstrated coordination, and made sure that no policy can move forward without considering what they just pulled off. That's long-game politics. And it's exactly what this protest was built for. Because this wasn't about getting everything they wanted today. It was about forcing the people in power to carry the weight of this protest into every decision they make next year. Every trade agreement, every subsidy negotiation, every infrastructure plan. They may not be in the room, but they are in the process. And that's how you win in a political environment that's used to tuning people out. You don't shout louder, you stay longer. And the ripple effect? It's already in motion. In the days following the protest, policymakers were dodging agricultural questions like they were radioactive. Press secretaries pivoted. Ministers gave vague assurances. No one wanted to go on record about what just happened, because the truth was painfully obvious. They had no clear response. The farmers didn't just overwhelm the roads, they overwhelmed the system. It's hard to pretend everything's fine when your capital has been physically gridlocked by your own population. These weren't foreign agitators. These weren't militant factions. These were citizens. Constituents. The backbone of rural Britain, with tensions rising across the UK and thousands taking to the streets of London right now. It's more important than ever to see the full picture. If you want to stay updated on the situation as it unfolds, make sure to hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. I'm covering the angles the mainstream media might miss, like this video if you believe in unfiltered reporting. And they rolled into the heart of the government with nothing but the tools of their trade and a plan to be seen. That's what makes this whole event so politically radioactive. Because it doesn't just raise questions about farming policy, it raises questions about legitimacy, about whether the people in power are still trusted to govern, or whether they've lost the plot entirely. And now the burden is on the state to respond. Not just with words, but with action. Because if they don't, they are signaling something far more dangerous than a policy gap. They are signaling that sustained, visible discontent doesn't require resolution. That's the true shift this protest has created. A government that can outlast a one-day march? That's normal. A government that survives days, maybe weeks of sustained pressure without blinking? That's fragile. That's reactive. That's a signal to every other sector that they too can force their way into the political bloodstream, not by shouting once, but by refusing to leave. Let's be clear, this was not a one and done. This was a model, a prototype, and it worked. And the reason it worked? It wasn't chaotic. It wasn't unpredictable. It was structured, organized, executed like a campaign, not a flash mob. And that structure is exactly what made it effective and exportable. Other movements saw it, other unions, other sectors, everyone struggling under policy fatigue, everyone sick of being shut out of the conversation. They saw the tractors roll in and realized this isn't just protest. This is participation by force of presence. It's not even about confrontation anymore. It's about duration. Just being there long enough that your issue becomes a permanent fixture in the policy debate. Like scaffolding on a crumbling building, ugly, unavoidable, but necessary until the foundation is fixed. And that's what Westminster looks like now, a monument to political delay, wrapped in the metaphorical scaffolding of protest. If government won't build bridges, people will build pressure, and they'll keep it there until the structure starts to shift. It's not just about farmers. It's about a political reality that's reached a saturation point. The government can't patch this over with a task force or a tweet. They can't wait for the next crisis to bury the story, because the story is the crisis now, the normalization of unrest, the quiet acknowledgement that disruption is no longer an outlier, it's a feature. And that's the real risk. Not tractors in the road, but what those tractors represent. The failure of traditional governance to prevent simmering from becoming boiling. The inability to hear signals before they become sirens. The assumption that if you ignore something long enough, it'll disappear. This protest shattered that assumption. Now, instead of asking how do we fix this, governments are asking how long can we absorb this? That's not strategy. That's stalling. And the people outside those buildings know it. Because you don't haul yourself across counties, line up in the cold, dump your livelihood on the pavement, and hold a line for 10 hours just for the symbolism. You do it because you've exhausted every other option. Because the system only reacts to crisis. And if crisis is the only language it understands, then crisis is what it will get. But even as the government tried to contain the chaos, the public was starting to connect the dots. People saw the story behind the headlines. They saw real livelihoods, real anger, real purpose. And that gave the protest something even more powerful than presence. It gave it legitimacy, because this wasn't performative. This was pressure, and pressure builds credibility in a way that polished messaging never can. That's what makes this dangerous, not because it was disruptive, but because it was credible. Because the public didn't roll their eyes. They nodded. They understood. They might have been annoyed at the traffic, but they got it. That's how support grows quietly, in the background, like a tide you don't see until it floods a street. And that tide, it's rising, because this protest, in all its stubborn, earthy, tractor-powered defiance, didn't just challenge policy, it challenged power. And it did so without breaking a single window. Let that sink in. 11 tons of cabbage and potatoes did more to disrupt the system than any petition, any forum, any neatly worded letter ever could. Because it showed up, and it stayed. So where does this go? If you're the government, you're now trapped in a new kind of standoff. You can't ignore the message, but you're afraid to legitimize the method. You can't call it criminal, because it wasn't. You can't call it irrelevant, because it's not, so you try to wait it out. But every day you delay, you send a message to every other disillusioned group in the country. This is what works now. And maybe that's what breaks the cycle. Or maybe it's what entrenches it. Because if civil discontent becomes a fixture, if protests are no longer moments but movements, the cost of doing nothing grows exponentially. Not just politically, but culturally. Trust erodes. Patience thins. And governance stops being about vision. It becomes about crisis navigation. That's the political terrain we're heading into. And this protest is a landmark on that map. So no, this isn't just about agriculture. It's about the next protest, the next sector, the next disruption, the next group that refuses to be quiet because they saw what happened when farmers said enough is enough. It's about a political system that now has to account for the permanence of pressure. And if governments don't find a way to respond with more than containment, they are going to find themselves governing under siege, not from violence, but from visibility. And that might be harder to manage, because you can dismiss an outburst, you can suppress a riot, you can deflect a scandal. But when people simply won't leave, when they keep showing up, keep being present, keep holding space in the public conversation, you don't control that. You respond to it. You react to it. You negotiate with it, or you fall behind it. And maybe that's where this is all going. A political future not defined by the parties in power, but by the people who refuse to be ignored. And if it wasn't clear before, it is now. This protest wasn't just disruptive, it was transformational. Because after 150,000 tractors rolled into the capital, it's no longer possible to pretend that the status quo is working. Not for farmers, not for rural communities, not for anyone who's been paying attention to the slow unraveling of trust between citizens and the institutions meant to represent them. The old protest model: show up, make noise, get ignored, go home. That's done. What we saw in December 2025 was something else entirely. A new kind of resistance. Deliberate, strategic, unshakable. It didn't scream. It didn't bone. It just sat there, immovable, undeniable, and maddeningly persistent. It was a reminder that political power doesn't always wear a suit or sit in parliament. Sometimes it wears muddy boots and drives a Massey Ferguson. The farmers didn't bring violence. They brought visibility, and they weaponized it with precision. 11 tons of food, once meant to feed a nation, dumped in protest. Not out of recklessness, but as a symbol, a message. This is what's at stake. And it's not abstract. It's not some distant policy problem. It's right here, rotting on the pavement in front of you. The sheer volume of that act, the waste, the scale, the visual power of it, was a form of political communication more powerful than any speech. They weren't asking for attention. They were demanding accountability. And whether or not the government wants to admit it, the strategy worked. Because it wasn't just about the tractors or the produce or the traffic disruption. It was about permanence. This protest stuck. And that's what made it effective. It didn't need to win headlines after the fact because it was the headline. It didn't need to beg for coverage because it was impossible to ignore. It didn't ask to be taken seriously. It forced the system to engage simply by refusing to disappear. And that's a dangerous precedent for those in power anyway. Because when resistance becomes routine, when civil unrest blends into the background and starts to feel like a new political season, everything else gets harder. Every negotiation, every budget debate, every committee hearing is held under the pressure of unresolved tension. It wears down institutions. It fatigues governments. It shifts the power balance, not by confrontation, but by consistency. That's what this protest achieved. And even if nothing changed yet, the message was received, loud and clear, especially by other sectors watching from the sidelines. Because this wasn't just a protest, it was a template, a live demonstration of how to resist without escalation, how to confront power without destruction, how to make your absence from the conversation so disruptive that your presence becomes mandatory. And now the question facing the government is simple. What happens when this model spreads? What happens when nurses do it? Or teachers? Or railway workers? What happens when every overworked, underpaid, politically neglected group decides that silence gets them nowhere, but staying put forces a seat at the table? The fear isn't that the tractors will return. The fear is that everyone else will follow them. And at that point, the government doesn't just have a protest problem. It is a legitimacy crisis. Because if governing turns into nothing more than crisis management, if policymaking becomes a long-term reaction to permanent unrest, then who's really in control? And what happens when political leaders start to look less like decision-makers and more like exhausted caretakers of institutional decline? That's where we're headed. Slowly, steadily, undeniably. And this protest was a signpost. So what does a path forward look like? For starters, the government can't afford to ignore rural grievances anymore. The agricultural sector isn't some quaint part of the past. It's a foundation of the present. And when farmers say they are drowning under rising costs, unfair trade deals, and slash subsidies, they are not being dramatic. They are being honest. And they are not alone. Because even if the tractors were the ones clogging London's roads, the frustrations they represent stretch far beyond the countryside. Every public sector strike, every underfunded program, every delayed infrastructure promise. They are all part of the same discontent, one that's now learned how to make itself felt. And more importantly, how to make itself stay. We're not dealing with momentary outrage anymore. We're dealing with embedded resistance, with political presence that doesn't dissolve after a press release or parliamentary session. And the only way forward is engagement. Not surface level, not performative, not a few meetings and photo ops. Real, sustained policy engagement, structural changes, investment, accountability. Because anything less isn't just ineffective, it's provocative. It sends a message that disruption is the only language power understands. And once that belief takes root, the system doesn't just become unstable, it becomes ungovernable. That's the real lesson of this protest. Not just for politicians, but for anyone who still believes in representative democracy. If people stop trusting that their problems can be solved through dialogue, through participation, through reform, then they'll find new ways to be heard. And as we just saw, those new ways work. So yes, this was a protest. But more than that, it was a preview. A preview of what happens when people refuse to be sidelined, when they organize, when they endure, when they drop 11 tons of produce in the middle of your capital and dare you to pretend it doesn't mean anything. And now that they've done it, the bar is set. No more one-day protests that fizzle out. No more polite petitions that go unread. If you want to be heard in today's political environment, you stay. You disrupt. You embed. That's the model now. And unless the people in power learn to respond with more than delay, distraction, or defensive press conferences, they're going to find themselves governed by a new political force. Not a party, not a movement, but a presence. Persistent, uncompromising, unignorable. And if this protest proved anything, it's that presence is power. So what comes next? That depends on who adapts faster, those in power or those left behind. And the thing is, no one really knows what this moment will look like in hindsight. Not yet. But years from now, when people talk about the political shift that began quietly but ended up shaking the foundations, this will be one of those origin points. Because this wasn't just farmers taking to the streets. This was an industry making a political statement louder than any union vote or parliamentary question. A slow, grinding resistance that proved you don't need to storm a building to send a message. You just need to outlast the people inside it. Westminster didn't get overrun. It got buried, slowly, with cabbages, with tractors, with exhaustion. And the government, they could clear the roads, but they couldn't erase a message. That's the beauty of this new form of protest. It's not about explosive chaos. It's about undeniable permanence. It lingers. It forces a response without demanding it. It doesn't knock. It just waits outside until someone's forced to open the door. This protest changed the calculus. Now, every policymaker in the UK, and probably beyond, has to factor this in. If we ignore a sector long enough, we don't just get backlash, we get disruption that stays. And even without winning immediate concessions, the farmers succeeded where so many others have failed. They proved a point. They showed that rural Britain is done sitting quietly in the margins. That neglect comes with a cost. And that cost? It might just be political control. Because if this kind of action becomes standard, governance turns into a balancing act, not between left and right, but between who can afford to wait longer, protesters or politicians. That's a terrifying part for the people in power anyway, because the farmers already proved they're not going away. They set the tone. They raised the bar. They turned quiet desperation into coordinated resistance. And now they've given everyone else the blueprint. So to those watching this from the outside, wondering if this was just a spectacle or a shift, here's your answer. This was a signal that patience has run out, that presence is more powerful than noise, and that the people who feed the country are ready to starve the system of convenience until it listens. That's not just disruption. That's strategy. And if this resonated with you, don't just scroll past. Join the conversation. Comment with your take. Was this a necessary stand, or the start of something riskier? Tap like if you felt the weight of what's really going on. Share it with someone who thinks protests don't work anymore. And hit subscribe if you want to be here the next time the streets speak louder than the speeches. Because if this was just a warning shot, the next one won't be quiet.